In the spring of 1882, a woman stepped off a stagecoach in Copper Bend, Wyoming, wearing her only good dress, carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag. She had traveled 1,400 miles to marry a man she had never met, and within 10 minutes of arriving, that man looked her dead in the face and said, "I don't want you. No money to go back. No family within 1,000 miles. No roof, no food, no friend in the world." Most people would have crumbled. Most people would have begged. Most people would have found a way to disappear. But Clara Whitfield was not most people. What she did instead would become the most talked about thing in Copper Bend for the next 50 years. She walked to the edge of town, found a pile of broken lumber that had been left to rot behind the old sawmill, and she started building. Board by splintered board, nail by rusted nail, she raised a shack with her own bleeding hands. The townspeople watched. Some laughed. Some whispered. Nobody helped. Nobody except one man. A cowboy named Silas Morrow rode past that half-built shack on a Tuesday afternoon, saw a woman hammering a warped plank into a crooked frame, and he pulled his horse to a stop. He sat there in the saddle for a long time, just watching. Then he did something that nobody in Copper Bend expected. Something that would change both their lives forever, and burn this story into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. But to understand what Silas did, you need to understand what brought Clara to that pile of broken boards in the first place. Clara Whitfield was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, in 1856, the third daughter of a textile mill worker who died with lint in his lungs before she turned 12. Her mother followed him into the ground 2 years later, taken by a fever that swept through the tenements like a whispered curse. By 14, Clara was working the same mill that had killed her father, feeding thread into machines that could take her fingers just as easily as they took her hours. She was not a woman built for self-pity. Life had beaten that out of her early. By the time she was 25, Clara had buried both parents, watched two sisters marry men who drank more than they earned, and come to a conclusion that most women of her era were never allowed to speak aloud. She decided that if her life was going to change, she would have to be the one to change it. That was when she saw the advertisement in the Boston Herald. Respectable gentleman rancher in Wyoming Territory seeks industrious, God-fearing wife. Must be willing to endure frontier hardship. Comfortable home and steady provision guaranteed. Respond with letter and photograph to Mr. Hector Dunn, Copper Bend, Wyoming. Clara wrote that letter the same night. She was honest in it. She described herself plainly. Brown hair, average height, strong hands, no great beauty but no great homeliness either. She told Hector Dunn that she was a hard worker, that she didn't complain, and that she was looking for a partnership, not a fairy tale. Hector wrote back within 3 weeks. His letters were short, but they were warm enough. He told her about his ranch outside Copper Bend, about the wide sky, about the mountains in the distance that turned purple at sunset. He told her he was 41 years old, that he had a good herd and a solid house, and that he was tired of eating his own cooking. They exchanged 4 letters over 2 months. On the strength of those letters and the $37 she had saved, every penny she had in the world, Clara bought a one-way train ticket to Cheyenne and a stagecoach fare to Copper Bend. She left Massachusetts on a cold morning in March, carrying her carpet bag and a small daguerreotype of her parents in a tin frame. She did not look back at the mill town. There was nothing to look back at. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of rattling trains and lurching coaches, of dust and bad food and sleepless nights in way stations that smelled of lamp oil and unwashed men. Clara endured it all with the quiet patience of a woman who had endured worse. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Copper Bend on that April afternoon, Clara stepped down onto the wooden sidewalk and looked around at the town that was supposed to be her new home. It was smaller than she had imagined. One main street of packed dirt, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple, a handful of houses scattered along the edges like afterthoughts. And standing in front of the general store, with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like he had just swallowed something sour, was Hector Dunn. Clara recognized him from the description in his letters. Tall, broad-shouldered, a thick mustache going gray at the edges. But the letters had not mentioned the way his eyes would narrow when he looked at her, or the way his jaw would tighten, or the way he would take one step backward as she walked toward him with her hand extended. "Mr. Dunn," she said, "I'm Clara Whitfield." Hector looked at her. He looked at her carpetbag. He looked at her face again, and something dark and dismissive moved through his expression like a cloud crossing the sun. "You're older than I expected," he said. Clara felt the words land, but she didn't flinch. "I told you my age in my letters, Mr. Dunn. 25. Same as I said." "You look older," he said. And then, without any more ceremony than that, Hector Dunn put his hat back on his head and said the words that would rearrange the entire course of Clara Whitfield's life. "I've changed my mind. I don't want you." He said it the way a man might refuse a horse at auction. Flat. Final. Already turning away. Clara stood there on the sidewalk with her carpetbag in her hand and the dust of 1,400 miles still on her hem, and she watched the man who was supposed to be her husband walk away from her without a backward glance. He climbed onto his horse, touched his hat to a passing woman who was not Clara, and rode out of town. The stagecoach driver, who had already unloaded his other passengers, looked at her with something between pity and embarrassment. "You got somewhere to go, ma'am?" Clara looked down the empty street. She had exactly $2.15 left in her pocket. Not enough to get back to Cheyenne. Not enough to get anywhere. "I'll manage," she said. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying was a luxury she could not afford. The first night, Clara slept behind the church. She found a spot between the back wall and a stack of firewood where the wind couldn't reach her, and she curled up with her carpetbag under her head and her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The ground was cold. The sky above was so thick with stars that it looked like someone had scattered crushed glass across black velvet. In Massachusetts, she had never seen stars like that. She lay there looking up at them and thought about what she was going to do. Going back east was impossible. She had no money for the journey and nothing to return to even if she could afford it. Her sisters had their own miseries to manage and no room for another mouth. The mill would take her back, of course, the mill always took you back. But Clara had spent 11 days crossing a continent to escape that life, and she was not going to crawl back to it because one man had decided she wasn't pretty enough. By morning, she had made her decision. She was going to stay. Staying meant shelter. Shelter meant building. Clara had never built anything in her life, but she had watched men build. She had watched carpenters frame houses in Lowell. She had watched her father repair the roof of their tenement with scraps of wood and determination. She had paid attention, as she always paid attention, because Clara Whitfield had learned early that knowledge was the only thing nobody could take from you. Behind the old sawmill at the edge of town, she found what she was looking for: a pile of broken boards, warped planks, and discarded lumber that the mill owner had left to rot because they weren't worth the trouble of hauling away. Mixed in with the wood were bent nails, a few rusted hinges, and a cracked window frame with half its glass still intact. Clara spent that entire first day hauling wood. She carried boards 1 and 2 at a time, dragging them across the scrubby ground to a flat patch of earth about 200 yards outside the town boundary, near a creek that still had water running through it. By the time the sun went down, her hands were raw and bleeding, splinters buried deep in her palms. Her back aching from hours of labor her body was not accustomed to. She didn't stop. The next morning, she began building. She had no hammer, so she used a heavy stone. She had no saw, so she broke boards to length by wedging them between rocks and stamping on them until they snapped. She straightened bent nails by pounding them against a flat stone, and she drove them into wood with a precision born not from skill but from sheer, grinding stubbornness. The people of Copper Bend noticed quickly. Martha Greer, who ran the boarding house, saw Clara dragging boards past her front porch and shook her head with the weary resignation of a woman who had seen too many frontier dreams collapse. "Poor thing," she murmured to her husband. "She won't last a week." Tom Paulson at the general store watched Clara come in on the second day to buy a box of nails with some of her remaining coins. He sold them to her without comment, but after she left, he turned to his clerk and said, That mail-order woman Hector sent back is building herself a shack out by the creek. I give it 3 days before she gives up. Even Reverend Hollis, who might have been expected to offer Christian charity, simply watched from his church window and decided that the situation would resolve itself. Women like that always found a way. They married someone else, or they moved on, or they simply disappeared. The frontier had a way of absorbing its failures quietly. Nobody offered to help, and Clara did not ask. By the end of the first week, the shack was beginning to take shape. It was rough. It was ugly. The walls leaned at angles that defied geometry, and the roof was a patchwork of mismatched boards with gaps wide enough to see the sky through. The door was a piece of planking hung on a single rusted hinge, and the cracked window let in almost as much wind as it kept out. But it was standing. It was hers. Clara had spent her last dollar on nails and a tin cup. She had no food except what she could find: wild onions growing along the creek bank, a few handfuls of berries from bushes she prayed were not poisonous. She drank creek water and ate what the land gave her, and she kept building. She added a sleeping platform made from the straightest boards she could find, raised off the ground to keep away from the mud and the insects. She patched the worst gaps in the walls with flattened pieces of bark. She built a fire ring outside the door from creek stones and taught herself to keep a fire going through the cold mountain nights. Her hands were a ruin. Every finger was swollen and cut. Her nails were cracked and black with grime. The fine dress she had worn off the stagecoach was now torn and stained beyond recognition. She looked nothing like the woman who had stepped into Copper Bend 9 days earlier. But her eyes were different. There was something in them that had not been there before. Not hope exactly. Something harder than hope. Something that looked like the first green shoot pushing through a crack in stone. It was on the 10th day, a Tuesday, with the shack mostly built and Clara on her knees trying to patch a gap in the north wall, that she heard the sound of a horse approaching and looked up to see a man she had never met sitting in his saddle at the edge of the clearing, watching her with an expression she could not read. His name was Silas Morrow, and the moment he saw her, everything began to change. Silas Morrow was not the kind of man who made himself known. He was 33 years old, lean and quiet, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in winter, gray-green and still. He had been working cattle in Wyoming territory for 8 years, first for other men's ranches and then, slowly, building a small herd of his own on a piece of land he had claimed 12 miles north of Copper Bend. He lived alone. He preferred it that way. Silas had come to town that Tuesday for supplies: salt, coffee, ammunition, and a new cinch strap for his saddle. He had loaded his pack horse, exchanged fewer than 20 words with Tom Paulson at the general store, and turned for home. His route took him past the creek, and that was when he saw her. A woman on her knees in the dirt, hammering a board into place with a rock. A shack behind her that looked like a strong wind might flatten it. Hands that were visibly bleeding even from 30 feet away. Silas stopped his horse. He sat there for a long time, longer than was polite, watching her work. Clara felt his gaze and looked up, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the clearing. The woman with the bloody hands and the cowboy on the horse, both of them perfectly still, like two animals encountering each other on an unfamiliar trail. "Ma'am," Silas said finally. Just that. A single word. Clara nodded. She did not speak. She had learned that speaking to strange men on the frontier invited complications she could not afford. Silas looked at the shack. He looked at the gaps in the walls, the listing roof, the crooked door. He looked at the pile of broken boards she had yet to use. And he looked at her hands, which were gripping the rock so tightly that fresh blood was seeping between her fingers. Then he did something that Clara did not expect. He dismounted, tied his horse to a scrub pine, walked to the pile of lumber and picked up a board. He examined it, turned it over, set it aside. He picked up another, then another, sorting through the pile with the practiced eye of a man who knew wood. What would hold and what would break. What could bear weight and what was only good for kindling. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask permission. Clara watched him for a full minute, the rock still in her hand, her body tense with suspicion and exhaustion. "I didn't ask for help," she said. I know, Silas said. He didn't look at her. He was examining a long plank, sighting down its length for warps. I don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for any. Then why are you doing this? Silas paused. He set the plank down and looked at her for the first time since he had dismounted. His expression was not pity. It was not charity. It was something else. Something Clara had never seen directed at her before. It took her a long time to identify it, and when she finally did, it shook her more than Hector Dunn's rejection ever had. It was respect. Because that north wall is going to fall on you in your sleep if you don't brace it properly, he said. And I've got a hammer on my saddle that works better than a rock. He retrieved the hammer from his saddlebag and went to work on the north wall. Clara watched him for another minute, then picked up a board and brought it to him without being asked. They worked side by side for the next 2 hours without exchanging more than a dozen words. When the north wall was braced and the worst gaps patched, Silas put his hammer back in his saddlebag, untied his horse, and mounted up. I'll be back through on Thursday, he said. That roof needs cross-bracing or the first heavy rain will bring it down. He touched his hat and rode away. Clara stood in the doorway of her shack and watched him go, the hammer-bruised boards of her walls standing straighter than they had before, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She felt less alone. Silas came back on Thursday, as he had said he would. He brought the cross-bracing lumber with him, not scraps from the sawmill pile, but actual cut boards from his own small stock. He also brought a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. He set the food on the ground near the fire ring without comment. When Clara opened her mouth to protest, he said, "It's extra. I bought too much at the store." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Clara was hungry enough to accept it without argument. They worked together that whole afternoon. Silas showed her how to notch boards so they locked together, how to angle a roof to shed rain, how to shore up a foundation with packed stones. He was patient. He explained things once, clearly, and then let her do the work herself. He never grabbed a tool from her hand. He never spoke to her like she was incapable. He treated her like an equal who simply lacked experience, and Clara, who had spent her entire life being treated as something less, felt herself unfurling in his presence like a fist slowly opening. By the time Silas rode away that evening, the shack was transformed. It was still rough, still humble, but it was solid. The roof no longer leaked. The walls stood straight. The door hung on 2 hinges instead of 1. And Clara Whitfield, for the first time since she had arrived in Copper Bend, smiled. News traveled fast in a town like Copper Bend, and the news that Silas Morrow was helping the abandoned mail-order bride traveled faster than most. Martha Greer mentioned it to the preacher's wife over a basket of laundry. The preacher's wife mentioned it to Tom Paulson's clerk. The clerk mentioned it to everyone who walked into the general store, which was essentially the entire town. Within a week, the story had been reshaped and embroidered into something that bore little resemblance to the truth. In the version that circulated through Copper Bend's parlors and porches, Silas Morrow had taken up with the cast-off bride, was building her a love nest by the creek, and the two of them were carrying on in a manner that would scandalize decent people if they knew the half of it. The truth, that Silas had spent a total of 6 hours helping a desperate woman make her shelter livable, and had exchanged fewer than 50 words with her in the process, was far less interesting than the fiction. Clara felt the shift in the town's attitude almost immediately. She had never been welcomed in Copper Bend, but she had at least been ignored. Now she was actively shunned. When she walked to the creek for water, women pulled their children inside. When she approached the general store to buy a candle with her last 15 cents, Tom Paulson's wife planted herself in the doorway and said, "We don't serve your kind here." Clara stood on the porch of that store and looked at Mrs. Paulson's pinched, righteous face, and she understood something that she had been slow to learn. It was not her poverty that offended these people. It was not her broken shack or her torn dress or her calloused hands. It was the fact that she had survived. She had been discarded by a man, left with nothing, and she had refused to disappear. Her continued existence was an accusation, a reminder that the frontier's promise of new beginnings was sometimes just another kind of abandonment. The women of Copper Bend looked at Clara and saw what they feared they might become if their own husbands turned cold, if their own luck ran out, and they hated her for making them see it. The men of Copper Bend looked at Clara and saw a woman without a man's protection, which meant she was either a temptation or a nuisance, and either way, she was a problem they did not want to deal with. Only Reverend Hollis made any effort at all, and his effort was worse than nothing. He appeared at Clara's shack one morning with a Bible and a suggestion that she might find more suitable accommodations in Cheyenne, where there were establishments that helped women in her situation. The implication was clear, and Clara's response was equally clear. She thanked him for the Bible, kept it, and told him she was staying. But it was Hector Dunn who posed the real danger. Hector had expected Clara to vanish. Mail-order brides who were rejected usually did. They found another man willing to take them, or they scraped together enough money to leave, or they ended up in places that polite society pretended didn't exist. Clara's refusal to vanish was an embarrassment to Hector, a constant reminder of a transaction he would rather forget. When he heard that Silas Morrow was helping her, the embarrassment curdled into something uglier. Hector Dunn was not a good man, but he was a powerful one. He owned the largest ranch in the county, employed half a dozen hands, and held the mortgage on 3 properties in town. When Hector spoke, Copper Bend listened. And what Hector began to speak was poison. He told anyone who would listen that Clara was a confidence woman, that she had misrepresented herself in her letters, that she was older and plainer than she had claimed, and that he had been right to refuse her. He suggested that her presence near the creek was a threat to the town's water supply and its moral character. He hinted that the shack she had built was on land that might belong to him, a claim that was almost certainly false but impossible for Clara to disprove. And when none of that was enough to drive her out, Hector went further. He rode out to Silas Morrow's ranch one afternoon and delivered a warning. "Stay away from the woman," he said. "She's trouble. A man's reputation is worth more than a stray woman's gratitude." Silas listened to Hector's speech without expression. When it was done, he said, "You finished. I'm trying to do you a favor, Morrow. Then leave." Silas turned his back and walked into his barn. Hector sat on his horse for a long time, his face reddening, before he wheeled his mount and rode away. That should have been the end of it. Hector had delivered his warning, Silas had refused it, and the matter should have settled into the grudging equilibrium that passed for peace in small frontier towns. But Hector Dunn was not a man who accepted being dismissed. And what happened next would test everything Clara had built. Not just her shack, but her courage, her resolve, and the fragile, unspoken bond that was growing between her and the quiet cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger. It began 3 nights later, with the smell of kerosene on the wind and the orange glow of fire against the dark Wyoming sky. Clara woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, she didn't move. She lay on her sleeping platform in the darkness, her mind still tangled in dreams, trying to place the scent. Then instinct seized her by the throat and she threw herself off the platform and hit the ground running. The north wall of her shack was burning. Flames were climbing the boards she and Silas had braced together, orange and furious, eating through the dry wood with a hunger that was almost alive. The heat hit her face like an open hand. Smoke poured through the gaps in the walls, thick and choking, and Clara stumbled backward through the door, coughing, her eyes streaming, clutching the carpetbag she had grabbed without thinking, the only possession she had left worth saving. She stood in the clearing in her bare feet and her nightdress and watched her shack burn. It went fast. Broken boards and dry lumber, a structure built from scraps and desperation. It never had a chance. Within 10 minutes, the shack was a pile of glowing embers and charred wood, sending sparks up into the black sky like inverted stars. Clara did not cry. She had not cried when Hector rejected her. She had not cried when her hands bled raw from building. She did not cry now, but she felt something break inside her, something she had been holding together through sheer force of will, and the sound it made was silence, a vast, hollow silence that filled her chest and pushed out everything else. She sank to her knees in the dirt and stared at the ruins of her home. That was how Silas found her. He had seen the glow from his ranch. 12 miles was a long way, but fire on the open plain was visible for 20, and Silas had saddled his horse and ridden hard through the darkness, guided by the diminishing orange smear on the horizon. When he reached the clearing, the fire was out, reduced to smoking wreckage, and Clara was kneeling in the dirt like a woman at prayer, her face lit by the dying embers. Clara! It was the first time he had used her name. She looked up at him. Her face was streaked with soot and her eyes were dry and empty. "It's gone," she said. Her voice was flat, drained of everything. All of it. Silas dismounted and walked to the edge of the wreckage. He crouched down and picked up a piece of charred board, turned it over and held it to his nose. His jaw tightened. "Kerosene," he said. Clara said nothing. "Someone set this fire," Silas said. He stood and looked at her, and in the faint glow of the embers, his eyes were harder than she had ever seen them. "Someone soaked these boards with kerosene and lit a match." Clara knew who. She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. Silas walked a slow circle around the wreckage, reading the ground the way a man like him could. Boot prints in the soft earth near the creek. The track of a horse tied to a tree 50 yards away. The dark splatter of kerosene on the stones of her fire ring where the arsonist had been careless with the can. "Two men," Silas said quietly, "came from the south, one heavier than the other." He knelt and pressed his fingers into a boot print. "New boots, square heel, ranch boots, ranch boots." Hector Dunn's ranch hands wore square-heeled boots. Everyone in Copper Bend knew that. Silas straightened up and looked south, toward Hector's ranch, and Clara saw something in his posture that frightened her. A stillness that was not calm but contained, like a rifle with the hammer pulled back. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't go after him," Clara said. "That's what he wants. He wants you to ride down there and do something stupid so he can have the law on you. He wants this to be about you and him. Don't let it be." Silas stared at her for a long moment. The muscles in his jaw were working, and his right hand was resting on his thigh, not far from the revolver on his hip. Clara could see the war inside him, the part that wanted justice fighting the part that knew she was right. Finally, slowly, his hand moved away from the gun. "You can't stay here," he said. "I know. I have a spare room at the ranch. It's not much, but it has a roof and a door that locks." Clara looked at him. She thought about what the town would say. She thought about Martha Greer and Mrs. Paulson and the preacher's wife and all their wagging tongues. She thought about the reputation she had never had and the respectability she had never been granted. Then she thought about the kerosene on the wind and the orange glow of flames eating everything she had built, and she made her decision. "All right," she said. Silas helped her onto his horse. She rode in front of him, the carpet bag in her lap, her back against his chest, and they rode north through the darkness toward his ranch. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the horse's hooves on the hard ground and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere in the hills. Behind them, the last embers of Clara's shack flickered and died, and the clearing by the creek was dark. Silas Morrow's ranch was small but well-built. A log cabin with 2 rooms, a barn, a corral, and a chicken coop. Everything was square and level and solid, built by a man who understood that in this country, what you built had to last because the land would test it. He gave Clara the back room and slept in the main room near the stove. He did not touch her. He did not look at her in any way that suggested expectation. He cooked breakfast in the morning, eggs and salt pork and coffee so strong it could strip paint, and he set a plate in front of her and went outside to tend his cattle. And when Clara came out an hour later with her sleeves rolled up and asked what needed doing, he pointed her toward the chicken coop and said, "Eggs need gathering. Watch the red hen. She bites." That was the beginning of it. Clara had not come to Silas Morrow's ranch looking for love. She had come because her shack had been burned to the ground and she had nowhere else to go. But something happened in those first weeks on the ranch, something neither of them planned or expected. They began to fit together. Not romantically, not yet, but practically, functionally. like two pieces of a machine that had been designed for each other without knowing it. Clara, it turned out, was a remarkable worker. Years in the textile mills had given her an endurance that most frontier women would have envied. She could work from dawn to dark without complaint, and she learned fast. Within a week, she was managing the chickens, the garden, and the kitchen. Within 2 weeks, she was mending fence alongside Silas, her hands finally healing, hardening into the capable hands of a ranch woman. Silas, for his part, discovered something he had not known about himself. He discovered that he had been lonely, not the dramatic loneliness of novels and poetry, but the quiet, corrosive loneliness of a man who goes days without hearing another human voice, who eats every meal in silence, who lies in the dark at night with no one to tell about the hawk he saw circling above the north pasture or the calf that was born with a white star on its forehead. Clara filled that silence without overwhelming it. She was not a talkative woman, but she was a present one. She hummed while she cooked. She asked questions about the cattle and listened to the answers. She sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the same sunset he watched, and sometimes she said things about the colors that made him see them differently. But the peace of the ranch was not the whole story. Outside its boundaries, Hector Dunn was still a problem. The fire had emboldened Hector. He had tested the limits of what he could do to Clara Whitfield, and no one had stopped him. No sheriff had ridden out to ask questions. No townspeople had raised an objection. The fire had been treated as a mystery by those who didn't want to solve it and as justice by those who thought Clara deserved it. Now Hector turned his attention to Silas. It started with small things. A fence line on the south edge of Silas's property was cut. 200 yards of wire snipped clean in the night, letting a dozen cattle wander. A water trough was poisoned with lye, killing a calf before Silas caught it. A rumor circulated that Silas had been rustling Hector's cattle. A lie so absurd that even the people who repeated it didn't believe it, but it was enough to make the other ranchers wary. Silas endured it with the same quiet patience that he brought to everything else. But Clara could see the toll it was taking. He was sleeping less. His jaw was permanently tight. His eyes, when he looked south toward Hector's land, had that contained stillness again, the hammer pulled back. Clara decided it was enough. She did not tell Silas what she was going to do. She waited until he rode out to check the north pasture, and then she saddled the spare horse, a gentle mare that Silas had been teaching her to ride, and she rode into Copper Bend. She rode straight to the general store. She dismounted, tied the mare, and walked inside. Tom Paulson looked up from behind the counter, and his face went through a sequence of emotions. Surprise, discomfort, hostility, before settling on a wary neutrality. "I need to send a telegram," Clara said. She dictated the telegram to the clerk, who wrote it down with shaking hands and sent it to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne. The telegram described the burning of her shack, the kerosene evidence, the boot prints, the cut fences, the poisoned water trough. It named Hector Dunn. It requested an investigation. Then Clara walked out of the general store, mounted her horse, and rode home. The territorial marshal arrived in Copper Bend 11 days later. His name was Walter Briggs, and he was not the kind of man who could be bought or intimidated. He was a former Army officer with a bristling mustache, a direct gaze, and a profound disinterest in the social politics of small towns. He interviewed Clara. He interviewed Silas. He examined the burned site by the creek and found the kerosene stains still visible on the stones. He followed the boot prints, now faded but still readable to a trained eye. He questioned Hector Dunn's ranch hands separately and watched their stories contradict each other. Within 3 days, Marshal Briggs had what he needed. He arrested 2 of Hector's men for arson and criminal destruction of property. He delivered a formal warning to Hector Dunn himself, making it clear that any further harassment of Clara Whitfield or Silas Morrow would result in charges that could take his ranch, his freedom, and his reputation. Hector Dunn stood on his porch and watched the marshal ride away, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. It was a lesson he would not forget. The arrest changed everything in Copper Bend. Not immediately. Small towns do not reverse themselves overnight, but slowly, like a river changing course. The people who had shunned Clara began to see her differently. Not as a discarded woman, not as a scandal, but as someone who had stood her ground when the ground itself was burning under her feet. Martha Greer left a basket of bread on Silas's porch with a note that said simply, "For the lady." Tom Paulson's wife, who had once blocked Clara from the general store, nodded to her on the street. A small gesture, but in Copper Bend, it was practically an embrace. And Silas Morrow, standing beside Clara on his porch on the evening after the marshal left, looked at the woman who had sent a telegram that he would never have thought to send, who had fought with words and law and courage instead of fists and guns, and he felt something shift in his chest like a key turning in a lock that had been closed for a very long time. "You saved this ranch," he said quietly. Clara shook her head. "I saved myself. The ranch was just nearby." Silas looked at her, and then, for the first time, he smiled. Silas Morrow asked Clara Whitfield to marry him on a Sunday morning in June, standing in the kitchen of his ranch house while she was frying eggs and he was pouring coffee. There was no ring. There was no kneeling. He simply set down the coffee pot and said, "I think you should stay, for good, if you'll have me." Clara looked at him across the kitchen. This quiet, steady man who had stopped his horse for a stranger, who had handed her a hammer instead of pity, who had given her a room with a door that locked and never once expected anything in return. "I'll have you," she said. They were married by Reverend Hollis the following Saturday, in the church with the crooked steeple, with half the town in attendance. Not because the town had earned the right to witness it, but because Clara Whitfield believed in grace, even for people who had shown her none. Hector Dunn was not invited. He sold his ranch the following year and moved to Montana. Nobody in Copper Bend missed him. Clara and Silas Morrow built that ranch together, board by board, season by season, year by year. They raised cattle and children and a reputation that became the standard by which Copper Bend measured decency for the next 3 generations. And if you ever find yourself in Wyoming, near a creek where a pile of charred stones still marks the spot where a shack once stood, remember this: sometimes the strongest thing a person can build isn't a house. It's the refusal to let the world decide what they're worth. If the story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because next week's story is one you absolutely do not want to miss.